The spring of 1945 crept across Okinawa like a ghost, bringing neither blossoms nor renewal. The skies were filled not with drifting petals, but with the low, ceaseless hum of enemy bombers. What had once been lush hills and small fishing villages was now a landscape of craters, scorched earth, and charred remains. Sakura Takahashi stood at the entrance of a dugout medical post, carved into the limestone cliffs, staring out at a world that seemed to be ending. At 22, Sakura had imagined herself tending to the sick in a quiet Tokyo hospital. But war had a way of rewriting lives. 2 years earlier, she had volunteered for the Teishintai, the Women's Volunteer Nursing Corps. Inspired by patriotic speeches and posters showing noble women tending to heroic soldiers, "To serve the emperor is the highest honor," her instructor had told them. Sakura had believed every word. Now, as the air trembled from the distant pounding of naval shells, she wasn't so sure. Inside the cave, the stench of blood and iodine mingled with the damp scent of earth. Lanterns flickered weakly against the dark walls. Sakura and 12 other women, a mix of nurses, clerks, and signal operators, worked tirelessly over the broken bodies of the wounded. Some were barely more than boys, their faces still soft and innocent, beneath grime and sweat. Others had been fighting for years, their eyes dulled by exhaustion and hopelessness. "Hold him still," Sakura hissed, as 2 attendants restrained a screaming soldier while she tried to extract a piece of shrapnel from his thigh. Blood slicked her hands, dripping onto the dirt floor. "We cannot give him morphine. We're almost out." The boys' cries echoed down the tunnels, merging with the distant thunder of battle. Outside, American forces were pushing inland after weeks of brutal combat. Every day, the Japanese line shrank. Every night, new orders came. Hold your ground, fight to the last man, never surrender. But they all knew the truth. The Imperial Army was crumbling, the weight of lies. During rare moments of rest, the women huddled together on the ground, sharing whispers and fears they dared not speak aloud. Their commanding officer, Major Hayata, still barked orders as if victory were inevitable. "The Americans are monsters," he would say, pacing before them with a pistol on his hip. "They will torture you, desecrate you. If capture is inevitable, you must take your own life." Sakura listened, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had seen soldiers do just that, pull grenades under their chests, or stab themselves rather than be taken prisoner. It was considered noble, honorable, the ultimate proof of loyalty. But when she looked at the broken men moaning on stretchers, at the wide-eyed teenage recruits trembling in corners, the word honor felt hollow. One evening, as the bombardment intensified, Sakura and her closest friend, Aiko Fujimoto, a communications clerk from Osaka, sat near the cave entrance watching distant flashes light up the night sky. "Do you believe them?" Aiko asked quietly. "About the Americans?" Sakura hesitated. "I don't know. I want to believe what we've been told. That they're devils. That they hate us, but—" She trailed off, staring into the darkness. "It's hard to know what's true anymore." Aiko nodded. "If it comes to it, I don't think I can take my own life." "Me neither," Sakura whispered, ashamed. "But maybe it won't come to that." The collapse. By late April, the situation had grown desperate. Food was gone. Ammunition was running low. The men guarding their position spoke in hushed tones about retreat, though there was nowhere left to run. The wounded outnumbered the healthy 2 to 1, and every day more arrived, carried in on stretchers, missing limbs, or already dead. On the night of April 27th, a deafening explosion shook the cave, sending dust raining from the ceiling. An American shell had landed nearby. The ground quaked again and again. Panic rippled through the tunnels as soldiers scrambled to form defensive lines. "They're coming," Major Hayata barked. "Prepare yourselves. Do not allow yourselves to be captured." Sakura's heart hammered. She looked at the scalpel in her hand and wondered if she was expected to use it on herself. The thought turned her stomach. Hours later, gunfire echoed through the ravine. Voices, English words she could barely understand, shouted commands. Then silence. A strange, heavy silence. It was Aiko who first suggested surrender. "If they find us hiding here, they'll kill us anyway," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe, if we surrender, they won't." Several women shook their heads in fear. Others wept silently. Sakura felt torn between everything she had been taught and a deep, instinctive desire to live. Then the decision was made for them. Surrender. The Americans breached the outer defenses at dawn. Heavy boots crunched over rubble above the cave. Shouts rang out, "Come out with your hands up." Though none of the women understood the words, Major Hayata, his face pale and gaunt, turned to them one last time. "I will not be taken," he said, raising his pistol to his temple. "Major," Sakura cried, but the shot rang out before she could reach him. He collapsed, dead before he hit the ground. The women stared in horror. Something inside Sakura broke. She dropped to her knees and grabbed a strip of white cloth from a medical bandage. With shaking hands, she tied it to a wooden pole and stepped toward the cave entrance. The moment she appeared, rifles swung toward her. She froze, heart pounding. "Watashi wa kofuku shimasu," she shouted. "I surrender." One by one, the other women followed, emerging from the cave with their hands raised. The Americans shouted again, but their tone was different now. Commanding, not cruel. They were herded together under the rising sun, surrounded by men in unfamiliar uniforms. Sakura dared a glance at them. They were not the demons she had been told to fear. They looked tired, sweaty, human. One of them even offered her a canteen of water. She stared at it, too shocked to reach out. In that moment, as she stood trembling among enemies who had shown her mercy, Sakura realized that everything she thought she knew about the world might have been a lie. The morning after their capture dawned cold and gray. Sakura woke to the sound of boots crunching over gravel and the unfamiliar drone of English words swirling around her. She was lying on the ground beneath a canvas tent, her hands bound loosely in front of her, the fabric of her once white nurse's uniform stiff with dried blood and dust. For a moment she did not remember where she was. Then it came back all at once. The cave, the white flag, Major Hayata's final act, and the terrifying sight of foreign soldiers aiming rifles at her. She was a prisoner now. Aiko lay beside her, eyes wide and unblinking. "Are we still alive?" she whispered. "Yes," Sakura murmured, though she wasn't sure why. Surely this was the prelude to something worse. The stories they had been told about the Americans were vivid and horrifying. That they would beat prisoners, that they despised the Japanese, that surrender meant a slow, degrading death. Yet none of that had happened. Not yet. A different kind of captivity. The women were separated from the male prisoners and escorted to a makeshift holding area surrounded by barbed wire. 2 guards stood watch, their rifles slung casually over their shoulders. They were not shouting. They were not threatening. They simply watched. A medic, an American medic, entered the enclosure with a clipboard and a translator. "We are going to check for injuries," the translator said in halting Japanese. "No one will harm you." Sakura's heart pounded as the man knelt beside her and gently lifted her sleeve to examine a deep bruise on her arm. His touch was careful, almost apologetic. "You'll need proper bandages," he said softly, though she understood only a few words. One by one, the women were examined their wounds cleaned and dressed. Those with fevers were given water and medicine. They were even provided thin blankets and crude wooden bowls of food. Rice mixed with canned meat. It was not luxury, but it was life, and it was nothing like the nightmares she had imagined. The first words, on the third day, an officer arrived. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed despite the dust that clung to everything. Through the translator, he asked for the group's names and roles. Sakura answered honestly. She was a nurse. She had tended to the wounded. She had no knowledge of troop movements or plans. The officer nodded, writing something in a small notebook. Then he said something that made Sakura's breath catch. "You are safe now." The translator repeated it in Japanese. "Anata wa moanzen desu." Safe. The word struck her like a blow. Could prisoners be safe? Could enemies offer safety? Later that afternoon, when the sun was dipping low and casting long shadows across the camp, Sakura noticed a young American soldier lingering near the fence. He was perhaps 24, with sandy hair and a tired but gentle face. When their eyes met, he offered a tentative smile. "Hello," he said in English. Sakura dipped her head slightly but did not speak. "Name?" he asked, tapping his chest. "James." He pointed at her. It took a moment for her to understand. "Sakura," she said quietly. "Sakura," he repeated carefully, as if the name were something precious he didn't want to break. He smiled again. It was the first real conversation she had ever had with an enemy. Shadows of propaganda that night. As the women huddled beneath their blankets, they spoke in hushed, uncertain tones. "Why haven't they done anything?" whispered Yuki, a former typist whose brother had died in the Philippines. "Why are they feeding us? It must be a trick." "It has to be," another woman said. "They're trying to gain our trust before they—" "Before they what?" Aiko interrupted. "They've had days to harm us, and they haven't. They even treated Kyoko's infection." The group fell silent. Sakura stared at the ground, her mind turning over the contradictions. She remembered the posters from her training, grotesque caricatures of Americans as bloodthirsty beasts, their teeth dripping with blood. But the men she saw here were nothing like that. They laughed with one another, shared cigarettes, even helped a wounded Japanese soldier to his feet when he stumbled. "What else have we been lied to about?" she wondered. "You deserve better." A week into their captivity, Sakura was assigned a simple task: help distribute water to the other women. It was during this chore that James appeared again. He carried a crate of canteens and knelt beside her to set them down. "You're doing good," he said, his Japanese limited, but sincere. "Strong." Sakura blinked, unsure how to respond. "I do what I must." He hesitated, searching for words. Finally, he said something she didn't understand. Seeing her confusion, he tried again, slower, with gestures to help. "You," he pointed gently at her chest, "deserve better." The words stopped her breath. Better. It was not a word she associated with herself. Not with this war, not with the shame of surrender. "I am enemy?" she said haltingly, the English heavy on her tongue. He shook his head. "No, people, all people, deserve better." Something deep inside her shifted. It was not instant trust, nor forgiveness, but the smallest seed of doubt in everything she had once believed. If the enemy could see her as a person, not a monster, not a tool, but a human being, then maybe the world was not as simple as she had been told. The letter from home days turned into weeks. The camp routine became predictable. Roll call at dawn, small rations at midday, brief interrogations that focused more on records than secrets. Slowly, the women's fear began to dull into wary curiosity. They asked questions about the soldiers' lives, their homes, their families. And the soldiers, many of them young and homesick, answered eagerly. One afternoon, James showed Sakura a photograph. It was creased and faded, but she could make out a wide field of wheat, a small wooden house, and a smiling family. He tapped the picture. "Home," he said. "Mother, father." She stared at it for a long time. It looked so ordinary, so peaceful, that it was hard to believe the man who carried that photograph was supposed to be her enemy. "Beautiful," she murmured. James nodded. "When war finish, I go home." Then he looked at her, a question in his eyes. "You? Home?" Sakura's throat tightened. Her home. The narrow streets of Yokohama. The paper lantern shop her parents ran. The quiet garden her mother tended. Might no longer exist. "I do not know," she admitted. He hesitated, then spoke again, slowly and deliberately. "I hope. You go home. You deserve to live." The words settled over her like a warm blanket. She turned them over in her mind that night, lying awake beneath the thin canvas roof. You deserve to live. No commander had ever said that. No propaganda poster had ever implied it. But now, in the heart of captivity, it was the one truth she clung to. A crumbling wall be the end of the second month. Something unthinkable had begun to happen. The women, once terrified captives, were starting to laugh again. They taught the Americans Japanese words. They traded origami cranes for chocolate bars. Some even dared to dream about what life might be like when the war ended. For Sakura, the change was subtle, but profound. The hatred that had been drilled into her since childhood began to erode. It was replaced not with loyalty to the enemy, but with a quiet realization. The men across the wire were not monsters. They were sons, brothers, fathers, just like the men she had treated in the caves. And as that wall of hatred crumbled, something new began to grow. The faintest hope that peace was not only possible, but worth believing in. Summer crept upon Okinawa slowly, like a memory of gentler times. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and made every breath feel laden with water. Weeks had passed since Sakura Takahashi had raised that desperate white flag. Yet each morning she still woke, expecting the worst. A blow, a curse, some act of vengeance. And each morning, the same quiet routine greeted her. Breakfast rations, a roll call, and the hum of English voices drifting through the camp. The fear that had once lived inside her, sharp and relentless, was softening, replaced by something far more confusing. Curiosity. A new routine. The American POW camp was not paradise, far from it. The women slept on straw mats in a long wooden barrack that smelled faintly of sweat and damp earth. They wore plain khaki clothes marked with large stenciled letters, POW. Their days were structured and strict. They cleaned their quarters, helped distribute meals, and were occasionally questioned by intelligence officers. Yet amid the discipline, small kindnesses bloomed. The soldiers would nod to them as they passed. Nurses from the Red Cross visited weekly, bringing soap, medicine, and even magazines. On rare afternoons, the captives were allowed to stand in the yard under the watchful eyes of guards, stretching their legs beneath a pale blue sky. It was during these small freedoms that Sakura began to notice things. The way laughter carried across the compound, the way soldiers spoke softly to one another when they thought no one understood. It was human, and it unsettled everything she had been taught. Language and laughter, one morning, as the women were gathering water from a pump near the fence. James, the young soldier with kind eyes, appeared again, this time carrying a battered English-Japanese phrase book. "Good morning," he said slowly in Japanese, his accent clumsy but earnest. Sakura couldn't help but smile. "Ohayo gozaimasu," she replied. He grinned. "Ohayo gozaimasu." He stumbled over the syllables, and she laughed before she could stop herself. A small, genuine laugh she hadn't felt in months. "Better," she said, nodding. From that day forward, James visited the fence whenever he was off duty. They taught each other words: sky, home, hope. He told her about Kansas, about endless fields of wheat and the sound of cicadas on summer nights. She told him about Yokohama's lantern festivals and the way the cherry blossoms would bloom along the riverbanks. They spoke with their hands and eyes as much as their mouths, bridging the gap between enemy and friend with gestures, sketches drawn in the dirt, and hesitant smiles. It was during one of these exchanges that James asked a question Sakura had long avoided. "What, you join war?" Sakura hesitated, the question pressing against scars she rarely touched. "I was told it was my duty," she said slowly. "To serve the Emperor, to heal soldiers, to be useful." James listened, brow furrowed. "You wanted to help?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Me too." The simplicity of it struck her. On opposite sides of the world, raised under opposing flags, they had both been drawn into the same storm by the same words. Duty, service, sacrifice. It was a thought that haunted Sakura long after their conversation ended. Seeds of doubt. Not all of the women were ready to see the Americans as anything but monsters. Some clung stubbornly to the stories they had been told. "They're trying to trick us," hissed Yuki one night as they lay awake in the barracks. "Don't forget what they did to Nanking. Don't forget the bombs." "I haven't forgotten," Sakura replied softly. "But they have not treated us as animals. Not once." "That is because they want information," Yuki snapped. "When they are finished, they will show their true faces." But weeks passed, and the true faces Yuki spoke of never appeared. The interrogations remained polite and limited. The guards treated them with respect. One even smuggled in a sewing kit when he noticed their clothes were torn. The propaganda Sakura had swallowed so unquestioningly now felt hollow in her mouth. If the enemy was evil by nature, why did they care if she was hungry? Why did they give her medicine when she was feverish? Why did James, a soldier sworn to fight Japan, look at her with eyes full of understanding instead of hatred? The questions gnawed at her until they could no longer be ignored. A confession by the fence one particularly humid afternoon. A Red Cross nurse asked for volunteers to help organize supplies. Sakura raised her hand. The work was simple, stacking bandages, cleaning bottles, but it brought her near the edge of the compound where James often patrolled. When he saw her, his face lit up. "Sakura," he called, "I have something." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was a letter, its English words carefully translated into rough Japanese on the back. She read slowly, her heart thudding as she pieced it together. "War makes enemies out of people who could have been friends. I don't hate you. I don't think I ever could. You deserve a world without this." Her hands trembled as she lowered the paper. "Why?" she asked. "Why tell me this?" He looked down, kicking at the dirt. "Because I don't want to fight anymore. I want this to end. For both of us." The words pierced her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future beyond the barbed wire. A future where she was not an enemy, not a prisoner, but simply Sakura again. The night of the bombing, but the war was not over. One night, the distant rumble of engines shattered the quiet of the camp. Searchlights swept across the sky as American bombers roared overhead. Even from miles away, the ground quaked under the impact of their payload. The women huddled together in fear, old instincts rushing back. Are they bombing Japan? My city? My family? Sakura pressed her hands over her ears and closed her eyes. She thought of her parents, of her younger brother drafted into the Imperial Army, of the house she might never see again. When the bombing stopped, the camp was eerily silent. James appeared outside the barracks at dawn, his face pale. "News?" he said softly, holding up a newspaper. "Tokyo. Bombed." Sakura's heart turned to stone. Tokyo. That was where Aiko's sister lived. That was where she had gone to university. That was where countless civilians, people with no rifles, no uniforms, had just died. She turned away, tears burning her eyes. James reached out, hesitated, then gently touched her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." For a long time, Sakura said nothing. Then, in a voice raw and trembling, she asked, "If we are not enemies, why does this happen?" James had no answer. The silence between them was heavier than any words could be. The wall cracks. The bombing changed something in Sakura. It reminded her of the enormity of the war, the scale of suffering far beyond their small camp. Yet it also deepened the strange bond forming between captor and captive. James did not defend the bombing. He did not excuse it. He simply stood beside her in sorrow, acknowledging the pain as real and shared. In that moment, Sakura realized that hate and grief were not opposites. They could exist side by side, and yet, even amidst that grief, compassion could still bloom. The wall between them, built by years of propaganda and bloodshed, was crumbling, piece by piece. The first glimpse of peace by late July, rumors swept through the camp. Germany had surrendered in Europe, and Japan was losing ground fast. The war's end felt close now, tangible in the shifting tone of the guards and the hopeful glances traded among the prisoners. Sakura found herself dreaming again, not of victory, but of return. She pictured herself walking the narrow streets of Yokohama, kneeling at her mother's garden, rebuilding what had been destroyed. And she pictured James, too, back on his Kansas farm, chasing sunlight across the wheat fields. They were still enemies, still trapped in a war larger than themselves, but they had begun to see each other clearly, not as soldier and prisoner, not as conqueror and conquered, but as two people caught on opposite sides of the same storm, and in that fragile understanding lay the faint, flickering promise of peace. The summer of 1945 ended not with a battle, but with a silence so profound it felt unnatural. It began with whispers, guards speaking in hushed tones, translators appearing more frequently, and the sudden arrival of senior officers in polished jeeps. The routine of the POW camp shifted, subtly at first, and then all at once. Orders were gentler, searches less frequent, and for the first time since their capture, Sakura and the other women sensed something monumental was happening beyond the barbed wire. On the morning of August the 16th, the rumor became reality. The Emperor speaks. It was James who broke the news to Sakura. He appeared at the fence, breathless from running, a folded newspaper clutched in his hand. "Finished," he said, his English clipped and deliberate. "War over." Sakura blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. "Over?" she repeated in Japanese. He nodded. "Japan. Surrender." The world tilted beneath her feet. For a long moment she simply stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend. Surrender was unthinkable. The word itself had been forbidden, treasonous. And yet, as she read the Japanese characters printed on the newspaper, "The Emperor has announced Japan's acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration." The truth settled into her bones. The war was over. When the news was read aloud to the camp, some women collapsed in tears, others stared blankly into space, unable to process what it meant. For Sakura, the feeling was something deeper than relief and heavier than grief. It was as if the weight of an entire world had been lifted from her shoulders, leaving her unsteady and breathless. The Emperor's voice had been broadcast on the radio. Soft, sorrowful, almost human, he spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering the insufferable. For the first time, he spoke not of glory or victory, but of peace, between victory and defeat. The days that followed were unlike any Sakura had known. The guards' rifles were slung loosely now, their orders tinged with something close to kindness. Red Cross workers arrived daily, taking careful records of the prisoners and explaining the repatriation process. Even the American officers seemed gentler, their faces lighter with the knowledge that the killing had ended. Yet peace brought its own kind of fear. "What will happen to us?" Aiko asked one night, her voice trembling. "When we go home?" No one had an answer. They had surrendered, a stain on their honor that society might never forgive. They had seen their nation defeated, a humiliation that would shape every breath they took. And yet, there was also hope in the uncertainty. Hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something new from the ruins. For Sakura, that hope grew stronger every day. And it had a name: James. The goodbye. 2 weeks after the Emperor's broadcast, the women were lined up outside the barracks and informed they would be transferred to a port city, where ships awaited to take them home. The announcement was met with tears and laughter, joy and fear. They were going home. But home was now a question mark, a landscape they could not imagine. On the morning of their departure, James came to find Sakura one last time. He was off duty, wearing a simple khaki shirt, a photograph of his family tucked into his breast pocket, as always. "This is goodbye," he said softly. Sakura nodded. "Goodbye," she echoed, the word heavy in her chest. "Thank you for kindness." He hesitated, then pressed something small and folded into her hands. It was a piece of paper, yellowed and creased. She unfolded it slowly, her eyes tracing the English words written in careful block letters. "No one deserves to be taught to hate. No one deserves to live their life as an enemy. I hope one day we will meet again, not as captor and prisoner, but as friends." Her throat tightened. "James," she whispered, unable to say anything more. He smiled sadly. "Live, Sakura. Please, live, and never forget. You deserve better." The words that had once shocked her now settled gently into her heart. You deserve better? They had sounded impossible once, laughable even, but now they felt like a truth she could build a future upon. Homecoming, the ship that carried them back to Japan, was silent, save for the rhythmic crash of waves against its hull. The women crowded the deck as the coastline of their homeland slowly emerged from the mist. Not the proud, unshakable empire they had left behind, but a nation scarred and broken. Tokyo was a skeleton of its former self. Blackened streets, hollow buildings, and the acrid scent of ash still clinging to the air. People moved like ghosts, thin from hunger and weary from grief, and yet, amid the devastation, there was life. Markets reopened, children played in the rubble. The first signs of rebirth clung stubbornly to the ruins. Sakura walked through the familiar streets of Yokohama with tears streaming down her face. Her parents' shop had been destroyed in an air raid, but miraculously, they had survived. When they saw her standing in the doorway, thinner, older, but alive, They wept as they held her, their sobs mingling with hers. Yet not everything was easy. Whispers followed her wherever she went. POW, they called her. Disgrace. In a society that had glorified death over surrender, her survival was not universally celebrated. But Sakura no longer let those words define her. She had seen humanity on both sides of the war. She had seen cruelty and compassion, hatred and forgiveness, and she knew now that dignity was not earned through blind obedience. It was found in the choice to live, to grow, to heal. The letter across oceans, months later, as Japan struggled to rebuild under American occupation. Sakura sat at a small wooden desk in her parents' rebuilt home and began to write a letter, her first, to a foreigner. Dear James, I do not know if this letter will reach you, but I hope it does. I am home. My country is broken, but we are alive, and there is hope. I want you to know that your words stayed with me. You were right. No one deserves to be taught to hate. I will spend the rest of my life teaching others what I learned from you. That even enemies can see each other as people. That compassion can exist even in war. If you ever come to Japan, I hope you will find me. I will be waiting to greet you, not as a prisoner, but as a friend. She signed it simply, Sakura Takahashi. A different future. Years later, Sakura would tell her grandchildren stories of the war. Not just the bombings, the fear and the loss, but of the kindness that bloomed in the most unexpected places. She spoke of the enemy who shared water, the soldier who learned her name, and the words that changed her life. You deserve better. And as the children listened, wide-eyed and silent, she would remind them that hatred was taught, but so was peace. The war had begun by teaching them to despise one another. It had ended for Sakura by teaching her something far more powerful, that even amidst the worst darkness humanity could create, there was always light waiting to break through.